Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here. Before I get into the video, let me remind you that if you like the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and if you'd like to see more of my content, hit that bell icon so you get notified whenever I post something. Also, if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all of this in my free time, so any amount of support I can get can help me bring more of this content to you more often. So without further ado, here I am with another TCG Tuesday. Today we're going to look at another deck tech that I made for Commander. I've been brewing up a storm lately. I know that recently Streets of New Capenna just dropped, and inside there they have that Rakdos Phoenix commander, and so you should be looking forward to one of those deck techs in the future because I was really excited about that. I also have an Azorius deck that is brewing in the background as well. A very group hug deck, so look forward to that. But today we are going to be taking a look at a new deck that I built with Averna, the Chaos Bloom. I was really inspired to build something that was going to be kind of silly, but still kind of stand up to, you know, the casual Commander world. So if you don't know who Averna, the Chaos Bloom is, it is a Temur commander, green, blue, red. As you cascade, you may put a land card from among the exiled cards onto the battlefield tapped, and of course you do this after the cascade has fully resolved. The cool thing about this deck is that it's going to be a cascade deck, but it's also going to be kind of a disguised landfall deck too, because the whole idea here is to ramp out with the Averna Chaos Bloom and get as many land drops as possible during any given turn to really trigger off those landfall triggers. So let's look at the creatures that I've included in here. There's quite a few creatures. Whoa. Wow, there's a lot of creatures. All right. All right, starting with AC, Tyrant of Gyre Strait, or Gear Strait. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So since we're going to be hitting land drops from Averna during cascades, not to mention our normal land drops, anything that we can use to create a draw engine would be really great. And since we can play an additional land each of your turns, it just really helps to bring out that extra drawing that we need. Next up we have Anamar, Soul of Elements. Protection from white and black. Whenever you cast a creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Anamar, Soul of Elements. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each +1/+1 counter on Anamar. So this is really helpful if we don't hit really good cascades. But just in general, if we want to get some of those bigger creatures out and play, you know, things like the Apex Devastator or something like that, having him on the battlefield is a really key part of this. And since he only costs 3 in his converted mana cost, you could really easily cascade into him. So he becomes a really big monster that your opponents have to deal with pretty quickly. Next up we have Annoyed Altasar. Annoyed Altasar has Reach and Trample, is a 6/5, and has Cascade. So obviously it's in here to get that Cascade. It has a converted mana cost of 7, so anything 7 or less, or actually anything 6 or less, it'll be able to Cascade into. Then we have our Apex Devastator. This guy's just 10 for a 10/10 Cascade, 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 so we can really take advantage of those Cascade triggers. Next we have Auger of Autumn, 1 and 2 green. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play lands from the top of your library. So it's kind of like a Oracle of Moldiah, except you don't have to reveal it to everyone. And if you have Coven, so as long as you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may cast creature spells from the top of your library as well. So this one has some of the functionality of Oracle of Moldiah, and then has some extra functionality on top of it that really makes it a very interesting card in this deck, especially paired up with Anamar. Next we have Aurora Phoenix. 6 for a 5/3 flying that has Cascade, and whenever you cast a spell with Cascade, return Aurora Phoenix from your graveyard to your hand. So just like any Phoenix, it has a recursion. Itself having Cascade for a 6-cost CMC is really incredible. The 5/3 body is super good with flying. It's just a really darn right good card. Next we have Avenger of Zendikar. 7 for a 5/5. Whenever Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control, and it has landfall. So the real thing here is that, first off, we're trying to ramp out super big. So when Avenger hits the table, it's going to create a ton of plant tokens. And then again, on top of that, with the landfall, those plant tokens are potentially going to get very large very quickly. It's going to pose a problem that your opponents have to deal with. Next up, we have Bloodbraid Elf. This is the iconic Jund Cascade card. It's 2, a green and a red. Haste, Cascade, 3/2. It's just a very good card. Next up, we have Boarding Party. 6 for a haste, 6/3 Cascade. Again, it's in here for the Cascade. 6 CMC. It's going to cascade into something good. Then we have Itali, Primal Storm. This costs 6 for a 6/6. Whenever Itali Primal Storm attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. Then you may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. This is in here as a big kind of, you have to deal with this really quickly, otherwise it gets out of hand type of creature. It's super good whenever it attacks. You can cast whatever your opponent's exile off the top of their library, which can be really devastating and just really speaks to the deck. Next up, we have Eternal Witness, 1 and 2 green. When Eternal Witness enters the battlefield, you may return target card from a graveyard, your graveyard to your hand. It's a 2/1. So if we have something that we need to get back, Anamar, Itali, Apex Devastator, Avenger of Zendikar, this is a great way to get this back. Then we have Ethereum Horn Sorcerer, 6 for a 3/6. It has 1 and a blue and a red to return Ethereum Horn Sorcerer to its owner's hand, and it has Cascade. So this is one of those things where it can reoccur itself. So it's got Cascade, and once you've played it and you've done your Cascade, you can then turn around and return it to your hand and do it again the next turn. And it's just a really fantastic card in here. Next up, we have Flamekin Herald. 2 and a red. Commander spells you cast have Cascade. It's a 3/2. This is a great way to allow Averna to come in and Cascade and take advantage of her own ability, especially in early game. You cast this on your 3rd turn, and then on your 4th turn you cast Averna, and then you're already taking advantage of the ramp. Next up, we have Emoti, Celebrant of Bounty. It's 5 for a 3/1 Cascade. Spells you cast with a converted mana cost 6 or greater have Cascade. So now cards like Itali have Cascade, and any of the other 6 costs that we were looking at earlier that didn't have Cascade, and I believe it stacks the Cascade. So if something already has Cascade and it's 6 cost, it's just going to have Cascade, which I think is a super good card. You can correct me in the comments down below if that's the case. I'm not 100% sure. But again, 5 with Cascade, so you're going to Cascade, and it just gives your big permanence Cascade as well. And here's a good example of a 6 cost that doesn't have Cascade that would get it. We have Kodama of the East Tree. 6 reach, 6/6. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. So now when we play cards or even cascade into cards, we can then also continuously play cards from our hand via the Kodama of the East Tree and really just bulk up our field and make it as threatening as possible, I suppose. Next up, we have Lotus Cobra, landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, add 1 mana of any color. So we got a ramp here. It's 1 and a green, super good. We've got Maelstrom Colossus after that, 8 for a 7/7 with Cascade. Again, it's in here just for the Cascade. Next, we have Maelstrom Wanderer, 5, a red, a blue, and a green. 7/5, creatures you control have haste, and it cascades twice. So again, we're getting the cascade trigger, but the really big kicker here is that everything we have has haste at this point. So it makes this deck start to get really deadly really quickly. Next we have Morog, Fury of Akum. 6 for a 6/6. Each creature gets +1/+0 for each time it has attacked this turn. Landfall, when a land enters the battlefield under your control. If it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. So we can really start to stack up combat phases and really start to lay in with big damage each turn just by having this card in play. Next up, we have Omnath, Locus of Rage. It is 7 for a landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 5/5 red-green elemental creature token. Whenever Omnath, Locus of Rage, or another elemental token you control dies, elemental, not just elemental token. Omnath deals 3 damage to any target. So what we do here is get as many landfall triggers as we can to get as many of these 5/5 tokens in play, which are already a problem because they're 5/5s, they're very big bodies. And then as they die, Omnath is just going to see all of those elemental triggers dying and start dealing huge amounts of damage to any target. It could be to your opponent's head, it could be to planeswalkers or creatures. Next up, we have Rampaging Baloths. This is about the same story. 6 for a 6/6 trample. Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a 4/4 green beast creature token onto the battlefield. So we're just going to try and create as many of these as possible and really make the board as threatening as possible. Next up, we have Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. 4 for a 2/3. Whenever you cast your first spell each turn, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card with converted mana cost less than that spell's, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. If you don't cast the revealed card, put it into your hand. So now we're going to take advantage of not just cascading, but now we're going to take advantage of just straight up casting cards from the top of the library if they happen to be, I think, what does it say, equal to or less? No, cost less. So if it costs less. So it's like having a cascade, except very limited. Rashmi is just really good in this deck. Next, we have Reclamation Sage. 3 for a 2/1. Whenever Reclamation Sage enters the battlefield, may destroy target artifact or enchantment, so we can get rid of anything that's pesky that's really causing problems. Next, we have Sakashima's Protege. 6 for a 6 with Flash. 3/1. Cascade. You may have Sakashima's Protege enter the battlefield as a copy of any permanent that entered the battlefield this turn. So we're really counting on the Cascade here. This card can have really bad effects if you whiff the Cascade and you get something that is just not a permanent. But if you do Cascade into something that during the turn that you play this, that just happens to be a really great card to copy, this will come in as a copy of it. It's just a really great card. Next, we have Scoot Swarm. 3 for a 1/1 landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that's a copy of Scoot Swarm instead. So this can get really out of hand really quickly if your opponents aren't keeping track of it. The minute you have 6 or more lands, you're actually copying Scoot Swarms. And as you play lands and hit landfall triggers, these Scoot Swarms get exponentially out of control. And since we are really trying to cascade and create as many landfall triggers as possible, this card gets nuts. Next, we have Shardless Agent. 3 for a Cascade 2/2, just because it's Cascade. It's a super good Cascade card. Next, we have Sweet Gum Recluse. 6 for Flash Cascade Reach. When Sweet Gum Recluse enters the battlefield, put 3 +1/+1 counters on each of any number of target creatures that entered the battlefield this turn. So if we're really stacking up on our Cascade triggers here, this helps you to buff up anything that just entered the battlefield this turn. And it can really be helpful with Scoot Swarm when it's landfalling. It can be really helpful with any of the Baloth, the Omnath, anything that's creating a ton of tokens to help really buff up those tokens. Next, we have Tatiova Benthic Druid. 5 for a 3/3. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life and draw a card. So again, we're just trying to maximize the potential of every land that's entering the battlefield. Next, we have Thrix the Sudden Storm. 5 for a 4/5 flash. It has flying. Spells you cast with converted mana cost 5 or greater cost 1 less and can't be countered. So we can really get around any of those really oppressive decks that are specifically blue decks that are trying to counter us from being able to do what we need to do. Then we have Tireless Provisioner. 3 for a 3/2 landfall whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Create a food or treasure token. So we can help really ramp out, or we can create that food token so we can get life if we need to. It's just a really super good card, especially in this deck when we're going to be landfalling as often as possible. Next, we have Wild Magic Sorcerer, 4 for a 4/3. The first spell you cast from exile each turn has Cascade. So if you Cascade into something that does not have Cascade, when you with this in play, it will have Cascade, and that's just a really super good way to make sure that you continuously hit those Cascade triggers. Okay, next we're going to take a look at the instants in here. Starting with Beast Within. It is 3, destroy target permanent. Its controller gets a 3/3 green beast creature token. Got to get that spot removal. Brainstorm, 1 blue, draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library. Chaos Warp, 3, the owner of target permanent shuffles it into the library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put that onto the battlefield. This could be potentially bad, but really, honestly, most of the time it ends up being good. Then we have Forceful Denial, 3 and 2 blue, Cascade, counter target spell. So we got ourselves a counter spell that cascades, and it's just really super good. Next up, we have Growth Spiral. Green and blue, draw a card. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. It's kind of like a ramp, and you get that draw card as well. Then we have Harrow. 2 and a green, sacrifice a land, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards. Put those onto the battlefield, onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. Then we have Natural Reclamation. 5 for destroy target artifact or enchantment with Cascade. So we're just trying to, again, get those Cascade triggers. And then lastly, we have Violent Outburst, 3 for a Cascade. Creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So we get that small little buff if we want to start swinging out with some of those tokens and try and get really wide. But we also get that Cascade trigger. Next up, we have our sorceries. There's quite a few more sorceries than there are instants. Starting with Blasphemous Act. Blasphemous Act costs 1 less for each creature that's on the battlefield. Blasphemous Act deals 13 damage to each creature. It's a board wipe. Yeah, they're pretty much necessary. You have about 3 of them per deck. Then we have Cultivate. 2 and a green. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards. Reveal those cards. Put them onto the battlefield tapped. And put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. Then shuffle your library. We have Farseek, 1 and a green. Search your library for a plains, island, swamp, or mountain card. Put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then shuffle your library. We have Genesis Ultimatum. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. Put any number of permanent cards from among them onto the battlefield and the rest into your hand. Exile Genesis Ultimatum. So this isn't going to cause any Cascade triggers, but it's just a really good card. We have Inevitable Betrayal. Suspend 3 for 1 and 2 blue. Search target opponent's library for a creature card. Put that card onto the battlefield under your control. Then that player shuffles. If you know what your opponent's playing, this is a great way to take out something that is just that they absolutely need. But even if you don't, searching their library for a card that is just darn right gonna cause oppression or cause problems when it hits the table, super good. Next up, we have Kodama's Reach. Search your library for 2 basic land cards. Reveal those cards. Put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. Then shuffle your library. Then we have Nature's Lore. 1 and a green. Search your library for a forest card. Put it into your hand. Then put it into play. Then shuffle your library afterwards. Then we have Rampant Growth. Search your library for a basic land card. Put that into play tapped. Then shuffle your library. It's basically our ramp suite here. We have 3 Visits. Search your library for a forest card. Put it onto the battlefield. Then shuffle your library afterward. Then we have Throes of Chaos. Throes of Chaos is a very interesting card in this deck. It costs 4, it has Cascade, and it has Retrace. So, as we hit later in the game, late mid-game, or just late game in general, we don't need as many lands hitting the field, so we can use those lands to retrace this over and over again to get those Cascade triggers. Next, we have Volcanic Torrent. 4 and a red Cascade. Volcanic Torrent deals X damage to each creature and planeswalker your opponent's control, where X is the number of spells you cast this turn. This is super, super, super good in a Cascade deck because each card that you Cascade into is considered having been cast. So this thing can get really ugly really fast. And it is kind of like a board wipe. Next, we're going to take a look at our artifacts. Arcane Signet, 2 for 1 of your color identity. Commander Sphere, add for color identity. 3 to add for color identity. You can sacrifice to draw a card. We have Crystal Shard. 3 for 3 to tap or 1 blue to tap. Return target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1. This is a good way to get cards that have Cascade back into your hand so you can replay them and get that Cascade trigger again. It's also a good way to try and bring your opponent's creatures back into their hand if they don't have the 1 to pay. But really what it's in here is to recast Cascade. Next up, we have Ingenuity Engine. 7 for Cascade. You can tap 1 and it to sacrifice an artifact to return target artifact you control to its owner's hand. This one I kind of think it's just in here for the Cascade because it has 7, but there are some artifacts that you might want to return back to your hand. Maelstrom Colossus is a good example. Or even if you're kind of doing it in response to keep something from dying, this is a fantastic way to save that. Soul Ring, so on and so forth. Then we have Meteoric Mace. 4 and 2 red. Equipped creature gets +4/+0 and has trample. It equips for 4 and it has Cascade, so we're just trying to get those Cascade triggers. Then we have Simic Signet. 2, and if you tap 1, you can tap it for the Simic colors. And then Soul Ring, 1 for 2. Next up, we're going to take a look at the enchantments. There's 5 of these right here. We have In Search of Greatness. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may cast a permanent spell from your hand with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the highest converted mana cost among permanents you control without paying its mana cost. If you don't, scry 1. So first off, if you don't do it, you get to scry, which helps you set up your next turns. If you do, however, it allows you, especially in the early game, to try and get some of that stuff that you may not have been able to cast right away out as quickly as possible. And it says you get to cast it, so you do end up getting the Cascade triggers if that ends up being applicable. Next, we have Rhythm of the Wild. 1, a green, and a red. Creatures you control can't be countered, and non-token creatures you control have Riot. Riot, if you don't know, when a creature with Riot enters the battlefield, you have your choice of putting a +1/+1 counter on it, or just giving it haste. This is super good in this deck. If you have weaker creatures, like for instance Averna herself, or some of the other cards with Cascade that have low toughness, you can bring them in, give them a +1/+1 counter. Some of the bigger creatures, like for instance the Baloths or Maelstrom Wanderer or Anamar, so on and so forth, just give them haste and you can swing in as soon as they hit the table. It gets really ugly really fast. Next, we have Sunbird's Invocation. 5 and a red. Whenever you cast a spell from your hand, reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. You may cast a card revealed this way with converted mana cost X or less without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So it's kind of like a very restricted Cascade, because you can only Cascade the top X cards where X is the converted mana cost. But it's a little bit better because you can cast something with equal casting cost as opposed to absolutely has to be lower. But I think the most important part is that it still stacks with the Cascade triggers, so you can Cascade and finish up all the Cascade triggers and then trigger Sunbird's Invocation. It's a super good card, and you pretty much at that point are going to, you may, maybe not, end up emptying out your deck. Next up, we have Timur Ascendancy. Creatures you control have haste. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. The idea behind this is obviously to get that draw card engine going. We want to play big creatures. The Rampaging Baloth is a great way to do this. But then on top of that, the creatures have haste. So we have a couple ways to give creatures haste here. Obviously, the idea here is to be as quick as possible. And lastly, we have Zendikar Resurgent. 5 and 2 green. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. And then whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. So again, we got the cast a creature spell. It's a little bit less restrictive because that creature spell doesn't have to be 4 power or greater. And then on top of that, we're doubling up on our mana. It's just a really great card. Lastly, well, not lastly, the last of the non-land cards we're going to look at is our Planeswalker. We have 1, we have Kiora, Behemoth Beckoner, 2, and a hybrid blue-green. Whenever you whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you get to draw a card. That's what it's mostly in here for, but for -1, you can untap target permanent. This one is good for... The untapping of target permanent is good if you want to ramp out and try and get something else in play. But for the most part, we have Kiora in here so that we can get that draw card for creatures entering the battlefield of 4 or greater. Next, we're going to take a look at the non-basic lands. Let me separate those real quick here. Starting with Boseiju, who endures. You can put into play for a basically tap for forest, or you can channel it by discarding it and paying 1 to green, and then destroy an artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search their library for a land card with a basic land type, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So essentially it can cost up to just 1 green, and destroy something that's probably causing a huge amount of problems, and allows them to search for a land with a basic land type. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to search for a basic land. It just means that anything that has a basic land typing, so shock lands, bicycle lands, so on and so forth, they can search and put that into play. Next up, we have Breeding Pool. It's a shock land for blue-green. Command Tower, taps for color identity. Dreamroot Cascade, check land for blue-green. Fabled Passage, a fetch land for basic lands. It's in here because it counts as a land drop, and whatever it puts into play is also a land drop, so it doubles up on landfall triggers. We have Frontier Bivouac, taps for Temur colors. Gruul Turf, bounce land for red-green. Ketria Triumph, cycling land for Temur colors. Misty Rainforest. We have our fetch land for blue or green. Again, it gets that doubling up on the landfall triggers. Rejuvenating Spring, crowd land for blue-green. Reliquary Tower, kills our hand size and taps for colorless. Rockfall Vale, check land for red-green. Rootbound Crag, another check land for red-green. Scalding Tarn, a fetch land for red-blue. Again, get doubling up on those landfall triggers. Simic Growth Chamber is the bounce land for blue-green. Steam Vents, shock land for red-blue. Stomping Grounds, shock land for green-red. Stormcarved Coast, check land for blue-red. Training Center is a crowd land for red-blue. And then the last thing we look at is our basic lands. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 forests. 1, 2, 3, 4 islands. And 1, 2, 3, 4 mountains. So that is the Averna Chaos Bloom commander deck. Obviously, the idea here is to stack up the cascade triggers and hit as many landfall triggers as possible. The big win condition here is to just get as many creature tokens as possible on the table as quickly as possible and just swing out for game. Obviously, we want to swing wide, especially if we have things like Scoot Swarm in play. Scoot Swarm really takes advantage of, Violent Outburst, and there was that other card that gave them some bonus, but I can't remember what it was. But anyway, yeah, that's the deck. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Let me know if, I think it's Emoti, actually stacks its Cascade trigger, because that would be super cool. And, yeah. Let's keep the comments positive. I will be removing any negative comments. And that's it, guys. Until next time. Peace.